Well, welcome to this week's episode of the Men's Collected podcast.
I love that.
Yeah, I know. Those that are watching or listening, we're in the same room, which is really fun.
Yeah.
We get to share a space together, which is always good to share space with a friend, be in person. We usually do this virtually, but now you can't. He's over
there.
He's over there. Although that looked weird. I don't want to do that motion.
That screwed up with my video.
Yeah. So today is purpose. And that's part of, Pierre and I were talking about this of what's important, what are we doing with the men right now in the collective. And I think a big thing is purpose. And I think what is our purpose? What are we trying to aim at here? And we live in an interesting time.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we can say that.
Yeah. I think what more talk about as men and fathers is what is our purpose and what are we doing here in the collective? So yeah. What do you think is most important about this, Pierre, with this whole topic here and what we're doing in the collective?
Well, I think I would start with a question to anyone who may be listening, which is, when you think about purpose, what might be your own definition? Because one of the biggest challenges, and I think something that draws many men to either seeking therapy or coaching or engaging in a men's group, certainly this is a massive element of the men's collective, is around building purpose, which I think means a lot of different things to different people. But if we sort of look at it as a conglomeration of many different things, as opposed to just one singular massive entity, I think it becomes a little clearer and a little easier to identify purpose. And when you think about purpose, what sort of comes up for you?
I think to comment quickly on what you said is that I think it can, I think one of two ways. It could become too narrow of an idea.
Yeah.
Or it could be so broad, it's like, where do I begin? It's like, okay.
Yeah.
On a personal, where I think of purpose, I always go back to a book that has made a significant impact in my life that I've read probably 10 times now, that I read in my early 20s, actually with my wife. Actually, we were engaged at the time. We read it together in a group.
Yeah.
Was Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl.
Yeah.
And we were part of this group and just kind of had these, big philosophical, deep life questions around purpose and meaning as it pertains to suffering.
Yeah.
And death and tragedy. What a great way to start pre-marriage.
I'm with you.
It definitely had us talking about a lot of pretty in-depth things, my wife and I. And this book had profound impact on me. I was probably mid-20s at the time. Sorry, it wasn't early 20s, mid-20s. I was probably 24, 25. So it was 15, 16 years ago. And since I've read it multiple times, it's definitely if I had to, take 5 books with me on a lonely island, this would be one of them, as far as if I had to choose 5 books.
Yeah.
Not a long book.
No.
And if you haven't read the book, go read it. Powerful book in a short amount of words. It's not long. It's very short, but it's all about what keeps us going in the midst of suffering and death and pain, and how do we identify who we're called to be or meant to be in this world. And I think we said this earlier, we live in a very interesting time. A lot of things are happening in the world as of yesterday and today and the past week. At the same time, I think if you look at history, there's been very interesting times of life. And of course, this book was written in the time of the Holocaust. And so very, of course, interesting time of a man who was put into death camps in Auschwitz and Dachau, a Jewish psychologist who had to figure out how to survive.
Yeah.
And it's his honest reflections of how did these men, because they were separated by men and women, how these men survive. How do they keep navigating tremendous horror, suffering, death, tragedy, a whole bunch of things, and what kept them going, and why did some die? Why did some live? And what he came to this conclusion, I don't want to totally, I'm giving a little bit of the book here, but essentially what he boiled it down to, and please read it because this is not doing the book justice, but my takeaway was really how suffering ceases to be meaningless is that we find purpose in it. And he identified it in 3 primary ways. One, first, is giving yourself to something you love, a cause, something you believe in. And I think there's many causes today that people put themselves into that they identify with something bigger than self. It can be anything, social justice issues to green economy to love to kindness to, probably thousands of things that people can give themselves to a cause. The second was the love of the other. And in this case, specifically for him, it was the love of his wife that kept him going, that one day he would see her again. And the other was giving himself to a higher power, whatever that means. And in this case, he was Jewish, so he had to believe in a God and the Jewish God. But of course, that can mean anything to anybody. But what it boiled down to is really about purpose came from something outside of self. It wasn't just about me and my wants and my needs and my desires that keep me going. So when I think of that, that's what I always go back to is that having a why. And of course he quotes, Nietzsche in the book, right? Those that have a why can bear almost anyhow. So he's pulling that from Nietzsche. He was obviously well-read. Arguably, I feel like some of these people were far more well-read than we are today.
Sure.
What they're reading, if not the same intelligence as we are today, if not better. I feel like some of these ancient writers. And so when I think of my purpose today, it definitely has to do with outside of myself. And in this case, my kids are a big reason why I do what I do. My wife, my family, my community, that it's not about me, that it's about giving myself away in a way that has a good impact on others. It's about giving myself away to, honestly, my neighbors, people that are different than me, that it has to be something outside of self. Because when it's just about me, and this is what I see working with individuals as well on a therapeutic level, when it's just about them, I think that's where we get problematic. Because in the end, that's where we start, that's where hope dies. That's where we let go of things. That's where we lose focus. Because our self in and of itself is not enough. Mm-hmm. And I even think of modern writers today, like Dan Siegel, really powerful book, much longer book. Go read it. It's called Intra-Connected. Of course, Dan Siegel's famous for coming up with words and making his own words. One of them is intra-connected. Love it. It's
a good word.
Great word, great book, way more in depth. But he talks about part of it is his own story too, about he had an accident on horseback riding, and his whole story about this connection to something outside of self, that we are connected to nature, to people, to beings. Great writer. If you love anything from Dan Siegel, go read it. And but same thing. It's all about, it's not just about me, but about my impact on a relational level, you and me, but also not even that, but an environmental level, like me and my environment, nature, and then the grand scale of the world. And so, he's not the first nor will be the last that talks about our connection to things outside of self. And I think truly that's where our purpose comes from. Now, this is a big meta level. I get that. I'm talking like meta, but I think that's important to talk about the meta. And I think what we do in the collective is we could probably do a little more meta, because I think meta is fun. If I'm honest, I think we need to probably do a little more meta than I'm thinking about it. But I think we drill it down to more practical application. Yeah. Here's how do we apply in our day by day life? And I think that's what we're doing here with how we devised the purpose, the 5 P's of purpose, is that here's how we kind of drill it down on some different planes of existence that we, I guess, more regularly, daily engage with.
Yeah.
But I think the meta is important.
Well, it's huge, because I think otherwise it creates too narrow a scope of even the idea of purpose. Because sometimes people will use purpose and meaning interchangeably.
Yes.
And it almost feels like it simplifies purpose excessively. So Frankl defined, I think, just to sum it up, he sort of defined it, and he was focusing on men, but also the use of man to sort of mean human in this scenario.
And he had logotherapy, which he devised.
Right, very much. Yeah. I mean, he sort of described it as the responsibility a man has for his own existence.
Yeah.
Right? That was the sort of summation of it.
And one of his famous quotes in that was our responsibility to life is that life asks us a question, is our responsibility to answer.
Yeah.
Which is okay. Meta.
Very. I mean, I think so. But it puts onus on us to really actually create something, as opposed to finding something out there. that's just sort of in the ether.
Mm-hmm.
But I think more modern kind of researched takes on purpose actually don't deviate a whole lot from Frankl's descriptor. I mean,
No.
there have been a few important studies around defining the core elements or at least components of purpose, and that in many ways was the precursor to our using 5 Ps that I think speak to men a little more regularly. And a focus beyond yourself is probably the most, I mean, they're all critical, but I think the focus beyond oneself is super critical, because otherwise we're at the whims of our ego, which is just like so potentially bottomless in terms of its need for validation and love and all of the things that we find ourselves seeking without much, and sometimes without a whole lot of logic. Like we can tell ourselves, I'm not loved, or I need more validation, even if we're surrounded by love and surrounded by external validation. So there's something really important to the focus beyond yourself, but also the 3 additional elements being commitments. See if I get this right. This was done by a psychologist named Kendall Bronk, who does research with adolescents and how they shape their own sense of purpose. And that really translates very much to core values that shape the decisions we make. And also personal meaning. So not only are they values that are, or goals that are important, they're important to us in a way that may stir our guts or pull at our heartstrings. But something you mentioned a little bit earlier strikes me as particularly important to men. And I think that's, I mean, it's important to people, all genders, all backgrounds. But I think for men in particular, there's so much of an emphasis on taking action. And so in addition to something being a focus beyond ourselves, in addition to the commitments and values, in addition to the personal element of meaning, we have to have some sense of directedness toward a goal or goals, having some clear sense of where we're headed. And I think that was at the core of thinking about our Ps, essentially our perspective defining what fulfillment looks like and what a vision for future fulfillment could look like, essentially a clear direction of where we're headed, defining the values that are so important to us and maybe the stories we tell ourselves around programming and principles. And then moving from that to really tapping into meaning, true meaning, what presence looks like for us, what our power is all about, and how we might take action. And rather than try to do that on our own, which I think is the MO for most men, when we think about our own sense of purpose. I mean, historically, when I thought about, what am I doing and where am I headed, I haven't generally turned to friends and like had an honest conversation like, hey, I'm struggling with this, and are you seeing this in me? I've been more, and I think this probably follows a pattern that most men face. I've been more likely to turn inward, read books, jot down notes that I might never look at again, create lists of things that I should do. And a lot of it ends up being not maybe intentionally, but maybe unintentional, performative. I'm putting an expectation of myself. Like, if I do these 10 things, then I'm going to be able to look at myself as a better man or a better leader, as opposed to just defining small actions to take along the way that might actually get me there and help me to lean into the important skills, the important values, the principles that I have already. That sort of internal stewing and listing and then not really following through, or following through only to find myself feeling the same thing about myself. It's jarring. And so without the connective piece, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice, which is
Yeah.
why, I mean, we both been in the place of, and still are in the place of working with men and helping men one on one.
Hmm.
But I think individually, one of the important things that brought us together was that we identified the not just the importance, but the necessity of
Hmm.
men doing this work together.
Yeah.
Because not only is the purpose work, I mean, the purpose work itself is not frivolous. I mean, there's a substantial amount of research that supports a positive association of having a strong sense of purpose to um, improve physical health outcomes and mental health outcomes, certainly, and quality of life related and quality of work and connectedness to our own sense of our work and one another. So there's no doubt that having a sense of purpose is important.
Mhm.
But there are all these sort of expectations that we might place upon ourselves that sometimes get in the way of our actually connecting to a true sense of purpose. And maybe the quickest way to cut through that is to be in connection with another man who's able to say, "Hey, I see where you're coming from, and also you're really good at this, and you may not realize it."
Mhm.
Or, "I really appreciate the way you show up in this way."
Mhm.
Or, "Actually, you've done this before,
Mhm.
and it didn't actually fill your cup," or at least my experience of you was very different than you might expect of yourself. So
Mhm.
having the kind of positive and sometimes the negative reinforcement um, around action in service of purpose is
Mhm.
actually really helpful to staying on track, to building track, staying on track, and steering back on track when you veer away.
You hit a point, so many points, but one that stood out to me is this idea, notion, concept, whatever you want to use, of in community doing this together.
Yeah.
And I think even I go back to Viktor Frankl's work, like he was in a very unique situation, but he was still in community with other men
Yeah.
in these camps. And so they found a way to navigate it together. Um, it wasn't in isolation. It wasn't alone. It was in relationship
Yeah.
that they found a way to bond and find and support one another, and in other ways find even dark humor in their situation to keep their humanity. And so I think something that we do here at the collective is it's in relationship, that it's something, again, you said this earlier, that we've done individual work with men, and one thing that brought us together was the power of doing it in relationship and community, not alone, not isolation. And it's funny because even a lot of men even I think struggle with when you think of group, it's like, no, I'm good. I don't do good in group or whatever it is their thought is. And I'm like, it's funny because that's actually probably what you need most
Yeah.
is the power of group, which is way, if I'm honest, more powerful than you or I.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, yeah.
way more powerful than you or I. Um, and I've actually seen that manifest in group with guys that I kind of sit back and they take over, and the power of the other men sharing and showing up is actually more, like a better word, therapeutic than me giving some speech or saying something powerful.
100%.
And so I think we saw that now I think seeing that this is important is in a whole other thing because we're coming against some barriers around masculinity and what it means to be a man and a community relationship. And what's the value around that? But I can't say I can't speak enough of the power of relationship and doing this in a group, in a community setting, and the power of accountability and not being shamed, not being one upped, but saying, hey, we're all trying to figure this identity and purpose out together. And what a better place to do it as we kind of wrestle with this concept together
Mm-hmm.
and push forward together. And that's what we're doing at the collective.
Yeah.
Is we're generating this space where we can do this together. We can wrestle with these big meta topics as well as the practical daily applications of how this shows up in our life, whether we're a dad with young kids or dad with kids at the house or not just a guy, whatever it looks like for you in your context, that there's something to this about finding a sense of our footing and grounding and direction in a life that can often pull us in a multitude of directions at any given moment as soon as we see a notification on our phone.
Very much. Yeah. We even recognized early on that our doing this together, you and I, is a reflection of the fact that this work is not really meant to be the imposition of one person, one man's values, or one man's ideas upon a group, which we see a lot of actually in men's groups, a fair amount. And it's compelling. It's also very risky in that it's easy for a man to say, okay, this guy leads a team of, or leads a group of 100 men. They must see something in him. And therefore, I'm putting aside my own knowledge and wisdom of myself in an effort to be taught, as though I don't have answers for myself. And that is counter our approach. I think one of the things we've identified is the more we lean into one another's experiences, and also the more we step back and invite conversation, the important conversation that most of us need to be having, but really are not, because we don't have the space for it, or an invitation for it, frankly. Unfortunately, the spaces for connection are, for men, few and far between. And when they are there, there's often an experience that might be limiting, either stigma or one-upmanship, competition. Not friendly competition is important, I think, for many men's relationships, but the competition around proving oneself as opposed to connecting and maybe challenging our own opinions and our own ideas in the name of growth, that's a limiting thing. When our focus is turning the attention back upon us as opposed to listening to one another, or really understanding one another and helping one another truly, we're doing each other a disservice. And so a big element of our work, and a big element of this podcast really, is facilitating conversation, ushering in ideas, inviting questions, which is why it's so important, as opposed to just sort of sitting back. You might be listening while you're driving, or listening on a run, or just hanging out. When it's so important to be able to step back and ask yourself, how does this relate to me? And what does this mean for my own life, for my family, for my work, for how I show up?
Yeah. So you're right. I think those questions are great to ask ourselves, Pierre. And depending on wherever you might be today, as Pierre mentioned, part of our DNA at the collective is that we kind of go deep in this, and we really start to define it. And it's going to be different for every man. But this is a big part of the foundations to which we kind of operate out of. And because we kind of need to know where we are, because depending on where you are today, you might have gone through a major transition. You might be going through a transition. And some men today, these questions that we've asked or posed today might cause some stress, might cause some worry. It might raise up some sense of confidence that they're really in alignment. And this is going to vary between those two poles, if you will, and somewhere in between. And you can ask yourself, where are you really today? As you heard that question, these questions, and what's rising up in you right now as you're even hearing us talk. And the invitation is to kind of go with that. Keep going. Right? That's the invitation. And what we do, again, in the collective is we really hit that. We really go deep with that. We really help define that. Now, we don't define it for you. We just create some structure and questions around it to help you define it for you, because you have to define it. No man, I can't define some other man's purpose. As again, full circle, as Frankl mentioned, life asks you the question, just like it asks me the question, and it's up to me, my responsibility, to then answer back, just like it's Pierre, just like it's yours. And that's actually what I think the world needs, is for each man to answer that question. Because what you have to offer is uniquely different than what I have to offer, versus different than what you have to offer. And yet we're still asked the question, whether we want to be asked or not. It's still there. And so today, my encouragement to you is, whatever chord was struck, whatever question arose, whatever thought or emotion got activated, sit with that. Ask the questions. Shoot us a conversation. You can always email us at info@themenscollective.co if you got a question. We're here. If you want to go deeper, check us out at menscollective.co. Any final thoughts besides that?
No, reach out to us.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're at info@menscollective.co. And we're also at menscollective.co. Just reach out.